Welcome, welcome. Today we're going to talk about ribbing. And ribbing has changed so much over the years. You know, when I was in the 70s, ribbing was like in a packet and you bought it and you put it on your cuff or your neckline and it was kind of pre-made, all of those things. Ribbing is so much fun and it's not that hard. It takes a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of, know-how, a little bit of practice. So we're first going to look at some photos. I want you to look at ribbing's used basically for three things. It's used for your necklines, it's used for your cuffs, and then it's used for the body of the garment as well. So I'm going to show you examples of all of those. First, let's talk about the neckline. And so what I want you to look at this first time is a common made mistake, and that the stitching is so small that it just it pierces the fabric too often, as you can see here, and it literally makes the ribbing kind of roll, or it just stretches it merely by stitching. So this stitching is way, way too small. The next example you're going to see is where the stitching is done beautifully. You can see it's a longer stitch length. I can't give you a number because I've noticed on this machine versus this machine, the same number gives a different stitch. But just if you're top stitching, and if you decide you want to, you can leave the top stitching off altogether. But if you decide you want to top stitch, then do a little sample, and then if it rolls like that or bubbles, or you can see it stretching, that's because your stitch length is so small. Open it up, lengthen it. The third example here you can see is a contrasting top stitching, and if I were you, I just, if you're a really good seamstress and you can stitch it well, do it. But if not, leave it off. It's not critical to the top at all. It doesn't make it look homemade versus store-bought. I've seen both examples in both cases. The next thing I want to go to is then sleeves, the ribbing at the bottom of the sleeves. It's done on a bomber jacket. I mean, it's still very popular and done on many occasions. So if you like it, it's good. You don't need it. You don't have to finish it off. But if you like it, then what you want to do is recognize that with this first picture, notice it's the unstitched edge that is the size that you go by. It is then stretched to the larger circumference of the base of the sleeve. And that's what the ribbing is used for, is to bring in the wider sleeve, which is more comfortable, more movable, to a fitted bottom. So when you try it on, this next picture is showing you, try it on around your wrist to where it's comfortable. It will stretch to whatever the bottom of the sleeve is. And then this next picture is showing you that that's the look it gets. It's ruffled, it's a little wide, and then it comes down. And of course you can make whiting wide, narrow. It's fun to play with it, but it is difficult to get a pattern to be exact when you're dealing with ribbing, because every ribbing is stretched differently. So there's not one stretch for every ribbing out there, and that's what makes it difficult. Okay, so now let's look at a couple garments. In this first garment, I just want you to see the whole garment's done out of ribbing, and I love it. I love the look. I love everything about it. The second one, if you notice, they start cutting it up and changing it different directions, and obviously I love that. Whenever the ribbing goes different ways, it's just a lot of fun to play with. The next one is a whole entire cape, and we've showed you some capes recently where the whole thing could be done out of ribbing, and it's a great look, simply finished at the edges, and it just is really nice. This last one I want to show you is obviously the one I have on. So I love turning the ribbing different directions and creating a visual, kind of almost like maybe a little bit of artwork out of the ribbing. So obviously you can see one is vertical, one is horizontal. The ribbing stretches in both directions, so it doesn't really matter which way you go. What I wanted to show you in this, if you'll notice at the very center of the neckline, there's a V-neck, and it can be done simply because there's a seam up the center front, which is used to create the top itself. So that's what we're going to focus on. I duplicated the picture and made the top I have on. So the fabric I'm using is 27.59. It's a ribbed. I used 2 yards. So I just want to talk about a few things I did. So the first thing I did is I used the sweater set, fabric pattern number 195, front, back, and sleeve, 3 pieces. I left a seam allowance down the front. You'll want to cut single layer. First off, you'll place the center fold, and be sure you place it right on the ribbing so that you get it straight. If the ribbing is crooked at the front, it will not look appropriate, especially if it's a little crooked. If it's a lot crooked, you're fine, but if it's a little crooked, it's going to look like you can't see straight. So leave a seam allowance at the front, cut it single layer. You'll need 2 yards, you know, if you're doing the front and back and sleeve. Just do it single layer, one across, one with the ribbing. And then the only thing I changed other than that, I added length. I added my little 6 inches because that's what I know I like my top to be, and I wanted to wear it with leggings. The reason I want to do this whole thing is we've got some beautiful ribbings. They're black, they're navy, they're charcoal. They're beautiful. There's this beautiful mauve color that we have. They're just really beautiful, and I want you to understand how to use them, and you can use them for little bits or big pieces. So in this particular case, because it has a seam down the center front, it makes it a perfect place to do a V-neck. What we know about a V-neck, I've showed you this in the past, that we have to have a little dart right at the base of that V. And so it is easily done if there's a seam up the center front to blend that dart into. So I laid down my French curve on the front of my 195. I did not change the position of the width of the shoulder. I left it right there so that it would meet the back the same exact way it's done. And the numbers that I used on the French curve were 19 at center front, 11 at the base of the shoulder. Now, when you use these 2 numbers, as you can see with the one I have on, you don't get a deep V. There's 19 and there's 11. So it's not a deep V, as you can see with what I have on, but that's what I wanted. And you guys know, I've said it many times, it's style choice. Go around, take your French curve onto different V-necks you have, figure out the numbers, finished, add seam allowance, and you'll have it. All right, so that's all I did to the top. Then when you go into the ribbing, you'll want to, in this particular case, the ribbing itself is actually ribbed. So you can see it's cut straight. So you're going to decide how wide you want it. I only wanted it to be narrow. In fact, I only wanted it to be 2 ribs. So in this case, it's only a 1/2 inch wide. So you double that because you've got to have 2 sides to it, and then you add 2 3/8. So 1/2 and 1/2 is 1, and then 2 3/8 is 1 3/4. So you want to just cut it, and I think kind of the cool thing on this, and you don't need to see this, I'm just cutting it along the ribbing. But I think what's fun is it kind of gives you cut lines because it's ribbed. So then go to the width you want it and cut that. Now the fun thing to me about all of this is once you've cut it, and you're not going to know the length because it's going to vary a little bit. I took 2 inches off of the total length of the neckline for this ribbing. But I will have to say that I had to trial and error a little bit. I had it too long. I only took off 1 inch in the beginning, and it was too long because, again, every ribbing stretches a little differently this way, and so you're going to find there's some variables. But once you fold it in half, and you just quarter the ribbing, quarter the neckline, line it up, and see it go longer at first. So let's say you just minus 1 inch at first, and you sew that, make your seam on the left-hand side, and then quarter the neckline, quarter the ribbing, and see if it will stretch. If it's just not enough stretch, then I took it away another inch. That's what I did. And I found that that worked beautifully. You can see it laid down perfectly. And that was that easy. I didn't have to sew it. I just had to quarter both sections to see if the amount was right. If you start off with too much, you can always back it down. If you start off with too little, it's tough to add. You don't want another seam. You only want the seam in your left-hand shoulder, which is where they typically are. But the easiest thing about this as I was sewing it on is they were giving me their stitch lines in the ribbing. So sew from the ribbing side up. So you literally are sewing this ribbing straight. If this ribbing is crooked, it's really going to look bad. But if this doesn't have to be straight, the neckline, the neck portion, the bodice doesn't matter. But the ribbing does. So sew with the ribbing up, see that you're coming in right at the same place all the way around as you're sewing the neck edge. And then once you finish, just turn and press it. Just press it, literally press this V in it, and that will give you like little stitch lines to stitch the little dart right at center front. And that finishes it up. It's very easy to do. It takes a little bit of patience, but mainly when you can get a beautiful top and you love the way the ribbing goes, it's well worth it. To me, these are great bases, a gray, a beige, a charcoal, the navy, all the great bases in this because they're gonna go under all of these things I'm gonna wear this winter. And it's so soft. I just love it. I mean, I just love it. I hope you do too. All right, so 19 at center front, 11 up at the shoulder. I didn't change the width. I just cut that off and made that V-neck, and then made sure you add the seam allowance. Add the seam allowance to the ribbing. Has a seam up the center front, just single cut it, 1 layer horizontal, 1 layer vertical. I added some length to the bottom, your call if you want to or not. 2 yards of fabric. It's just fun sewing. It's really fun, easy sewing. And you can see it's almost like a little artsy top. And it's a little offbeat from the norm, and I think that's who I am. Happy sewing from Silhouette Patterns.